Hello and welcome to UC Partner Summit. I'm Tom Wright from UC today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Brian from Alianza. How's it going, Brian?
Going great, Tom. Thanks for having me today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And we're going to be talking about the service provider landscape, which is where you guys specialize. But to start with, could you give us a quick overview of Alianza, please?
Yeah, you bet. Allianz has been around for going on, I guess, 13 years now plus. Really, our roots are in communications platforms for service providers and helping service providers grow and thrive in an ever more complex environment. Alianza today is the leading provider of cloud communications platform solutions for broadband service providers of all types. So think fiber broadband, wireless broadband, cable broadband, you name it. If you're delivering a broadband connection into a home or business, Alianza wants to be your partner to help power cutting edge communication services.
Yeah, and there's obviously been a lot of change in the communications market over the last couple of years, and that change is going to continue kind of looking forward. I wonder if you could talk through some of the biggest challenges that service providers are facing at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there's a handful that come to mind. I guess the first one is maybe backing up kind of macro level. Um, I saw a research note a couple weeks ago. I think it was by Metergy, stating that we're now at 47% market penetration for UCaaS. So we're not quite halfway there, but we're approaching the hump. And I think with that benchmark comes some new dynamics to the marketplace. First and foremost, I think it just means we're going to have more increasing competition, more players in the market. Obviously, the market continues to expand and grow. It also means that with that competition comes increased pricing pressure, increasing pressure to be competitive with the products, making sure you have product market fit, that you're addressing your customers' needs. So I think it's just, in some ways, it's becoming more exciting because there's more communications spend available from customers. But it's also becoming more complex because there's more products, more use cases, more vertical segmentation. And so, it's both an opportunity and a challenge for service providers right now. I think the other thing that kind of comes to mind is if you look at service providers, once again, high level, the last decade when it comes to communication services have been a challenge for service providers. I think for a lot of respects, and I think most service providers, if you were to walk into the C-suite or the boardroom, it's no secret that service providers lament the fact that they've lost so much share to the over-the-top competitors. And I think now, it's kind of easy sitting in 2020, looking back in hindsight, armchair quarterbacking, maybe Monday morning, what happened over the last decade. And I think a lot of the transition and market share that has flowed from service providers to over the top providers really is rooted in the fact that service providers 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even 20 years ago, implemented legacy communications infrastructure inside their networks. And this infrastructure really has hamstrung them from competing with over the top providers that are running on cloud agile platforms that can innovate faster, that are constantly delivering new feature, new functionality, and addressing customer demands, and ensuring that as the market evolves, they maintain that product market fit. And it's really, if you look at it just from a pure product perspective, the over the top providers have really just out innovated service providers for the last decade. I think that's the biggest challenge facing service providers is how do you differentiate again? How do you take back market share? How do you ensure that that broadband connection that you own is a defensible competitive advantage that you're leveraging? And that the platform that you have powering your communication services is enabling that competitive advantage, not a ball and chain holding you back. And Alianza really, our mission is to be the antidote to that challenge, to come in and work with service providers and give them a cloud communications platform that is cloud native, that is agile, that is adaptive, that is constantly innovating in a way that allows them to compete in the market like they haven't been able to for the last decade.
And you and the team at Alianza do a lot of great work in terms of educating service providers about the benefits of moving to a cloud-based model, or maybe kind of just showing why it's not something to be fearful of and something they could be successful with. I wonder if you could explain some of the risks maybe to not making this move to cloud and relying on that legacy infrastructure that may have served them quite well up until now.
Yeah, Tom, it's a fair question. I think that When you look at service providers, they've been very good at touting the story to enterprises on why they should ditch the switch and upgrade to a cloud communications PBX, right? A cloud PBX or a virtual PBX or unified communications. And so helping if you're the service provider, you've become over the last decade, I think, fairly conversant in the benefits of walking into a business customer and saying, hey, ditch that PBX that sits in your network closet and cloud source it with us. But for the service provider, a lot of the same value props that they've been pitching to their customers apply to them now when it comes to their own network infrastructure. And they should be taking a look at their infrastructure and asking themselves, does this provide the feature, the functionality? Does it meet the needs of the business? And I think the answer clearly is the market has spoken, and the answer is no. Billions of dollars of market value have been diverted to over-the-top competitors. And it's just that's got to be like the number one risk of not moving to a cloud operating environment, is that the next decade looks a lot like the last decade. And I don't think that's a really exciting place to be for service providers, because if the next decade looks like the last decade, service providers will increasingly look like the dumb pipe that the fear has been that they just become transport and access. And yet the service providers are so strategically positioned to be so much more than that. They've just been held back by legacy infrastructure. I think that, building on that, if they don't move and they hang on to that legacy infrastructure, not only do they risk not capturing new business and giving up revenue streams to competitors, but I think they also risk losing the revenue that they already have. Customers are savvy. They're not going to hang on to legacy solutions indefinitely. And in the best case scenario for a service provider that's hanging on to legacy infrastructure, it's a slow melt like an ice cube. Worst case scenario is we work with operators all the time that have aging legacy infrastructure that's end of life, that literally they cannot find replacement parts and pieces for. They don't have people to manage it anymore. The folks that manage what we'll call voice 1.0 infrastructure in service provider space have been managed by a generation that is largely transitioning out of the workforce at this stage. And the rising generation, in Gen X, Gen Z, they want to come in and they want to work with modern, agile, cloud operating environments, and they're kind of drawn to the new sexy technology. And it's really hard for some service providers, especially in, I'll call it like non-metro markets, to find talent to manage these old legacy aging platforms. So I think you kind of bring all that together. And if you're a service provider, now is the time to really start looking in earnest of, how do I get off these legacy soft switches? How do I get onto a cloud operating environment that frees up me from the shackles of this old legacy infrastructure, gives me a modern product, gives me a better operating environment, and really transforms my business for the challenge that's ahead of us over the next decade.
And so, just looking at the market, do you speak to and still see operators that really are still very reluctant to actually go through with this?
We see much less reluctance than we did, say, 10 years ago. I mean, when Alianza was the first cloud, at the time, cloud voice platform. We were exclusively voice when we started. Now we're texting and messaging and UCaaS and so much more, and really a broader communications platform. But when we started, there was a lot of reluctance. Service providers wanted to own the platform. They wanted it to be in their data centers. That's how they'd always done it. I mean, some of the customers that we work with are telephone companies that have been the telephone company, owning the telephone infrastructure for over 100 years. Think about that, Tom. You have a century worth of pride about building a telephone network. And now the market has changed and it's moved. And in a lot of cases, those telephone companies are overbuilding fiber, they're bringing broadband access, but they have to give up that control over the switch that sat inside their network. And I think there was just a reluctance to do so, even though they were out telling a story to the market and to their customers about why they should ditch their PBX and move to a cloud operating environment. They themselves have had hesitancy to do that. I would say every single year over the last decade, we've seen an uptick in the willingness and the openness to move to the cloud, to cloud source, we call it. And I think that just comes down to a couple different things. Like, number one, the folks that are operating those networks are younger and more tech savvy and want cloud operating environments. Number two, the operators themselves want to divert as much of their capital resources into broadband infrastructure facilities build as possible. And that means that at the end of the day, the cloud model preserves cash that allows them to capitalize on their number one strategic initiative, which is building broadband access and footprint. And from a capital perspective, we've started to become a bigger and bigger fit. And then maybe I'll just add one more element to this, which is every other piece of the service provider's network, every other piece of software application is moving to the cloud or has moved to the cloud. If you're a wireless operator, everything from your core, your network access, if you're providing content, your content management systems, your directories, your DVR functionality, your set-top box functionality if you're a cable company, all your heck, the firewalls and in many cases like switches and kind of core routing elements are all cloud sourced now. Our DDoS prevention and mitigation and monitoring tools, so much of this has moved to the cloud. And so over the last decade, as service providers have kind of started with dipping their toe and now they're kind of up to their waist, the last big piece of infrastructure that hasn't moved is their core communications network. And we just feel like, hey, the time is right to start talking about this in a bigger way, and for service providers really to start addressing that aging network infrastructure that's been holding them back in the market. And they're already up to their waist. Dive in. Just go. Cloud source the whole thing.
I think you summed it up perfectly a few minutes ago, actually, when you said they kind of owned this core infrastructure for 100 years. It makes it sound like a real sort of existential threat and a real change of culture for them to take that final dive, as you say.
Yeah, it really is. It's scary. And a lot of, some of this, I guess, is there's multiple vectors on which these decisions are made. Certainly, like there's financial, there's product, there's innovation, but there's also a people aspect to this, right? And I think for a long time, service providers, network engineers and communications managers that have been managing these soft switches have looked at this and said, hey, I've built a team and it's a good team. And these people are smart, they're sharp, they're committed, they're dedicated. They've been running this network for decades for us. What about the people element? What about the human element of this? And I think now that, we have almost 200 service providers that have cloud sourced with Alianza, the results have been resoundingly positive for the individuals, for the people, because they don't just get to learn new skills and new systems, new ways of doing things, but in many cases, the business has been able to give them optionality and choices and saying, hey, we're making this big change in our network. We're going to need a lot less people to manage it. We have a bunch of other opportunities inside the company. What do you want to do at this point in your career? And it's been interesting. A lot of these people, I would say, are not necessarily passionately tied to managing 10, 20, 30-year-old communications infrastructure. It's an opportunity to learn and change and really move into the next decade with a new skill set.
And we've spoken quite a lot about the technology, but you did touch on the finances a few minutes ago. And I wonder if how you see service providers kind of preparing for the change in model. And is there a fear or misconception that maybe it's hard to make money when you've got a cloud-based infrastructure?
Oh, I think it's a complete misnomer. We've been walking into customers and enterprise, and I'll use this analogy all day long because I think it resonates with service providers. But the cloud communications platform for an enterprise would not have worked if you walked in and said, hey, you're going to pay more over the long run than you're going to pay for your PBX. The reality is it's the cloud operating model is more capital efficient, more cost efficient. The total cost of ownership is better. That applies to the enterprise, also applies to the service provider. Part of the challenge is when you look at a service provider, I think historically there's been kind of the easy button on doing a cost analysis to say, oh, well, how much do I pay per seat, per license for my soft switch? And what's my support and maintenance on that yearly? That's my cost of delivering services. Oh, but when you actually peel the layer of the onion, there's 1,000 different layers on this onion. And most service providers, when we really delve into it with them, and we have a total cost of ownership operating model that we share with them, and we can kind of walk them through this process. But there ends up being 1.5 to 24 different vendors in the mix. There ends up being teams of people internally that manage this, everybody from procurement, vendor management, product management, integration on the back end to make those 20, 25 vendors all stitch together and work well. And it starts at kind of the edge with your session border controllers and yes, your soft switches, but it's LCR, least cost routing management, routing tables, fraud prevention, tax management, billing, CDRs, reporting, soft phone clients, endpoints, device management, device certification. There's just, quality assurance and testing before they launch new product. There's so many elements in the service provider network that their total cost of ownership is today in a legacy environment is death by 1,000 pennies, right? There's so many nickels and dimes in there that when you add all those up, they're actually not, they're leaving money on the table. And moving to the cloud is when we run these, analyses with customers and have them really look at what their actual cost is, they're flabbergasted. And they come back and they look at the cloud operating model and say, you're telling me this is it? It's one line item per product per month. I have consistent margin control. I know exactly what my margins are going to be on a per unit basis and on an overall basis. There's no variability anymore in this equation. Let's go, right? Never cut another capital check again. And align your margins with your success. And from customer one, you know exactly what your gross margin contribution is going to be. The gross margin and the return on investment is no longer a function of how fast you scale, how fast you grow, how saturated you are on your licenses that you've purchased in the past. It is 100% aligned to your success. And that gross margin profile shouldn't change. So yeah, the finances are kind of a no-brainer. That's the kind of backbone of moving to the cloud. Simple, easy, cost-effective, so forth.
Okay, and then let's just think about everything we've discussed over the last few minutes, kind of wrap it all together. Could you pick out some of the really key things that Alianza is doing to help service providers on this sort of very transformational journey?
Yeah, certainly. I would say, trying to bring it all to a head, I would say there's certainly value in saving money. There's certainly value in replacing legacy, modern, aging infrastructure with modern cloud solution. And there's implications, strategic implications, capital implications. Those are all easy. And I think those are in some ways, that's the whip though. Like, hey, you have to do this. The fear-driven side is if you don't, your infrastructure is going to fall over. You're not going to have people to manage it. Or, hey, I could save money and maybe, cut my costs. That's also, I'd say, like, that's kind of a lesser reason to do this. The number one reason why service providers need to cloud source is to regain competitive advantage in the marketplace, regain differentiation, be able to go to market with a broad suite of communication services that, coupled with their broadband assets, are going to give them a defensible strategic advantage for the next decade. Help them grow share back, help them win, help them create value by growing revenue, growing customers, serving their customer bases better than they've been able to at any time in the past with communications products. So, top line, grow it, take market share, win again. Have your sales force feel like they're walking into every sales environment on their toes instead of on their heels. And Alianza is going to be the partner that's going to help power that for you.
Okay, I've just got one final question for you. Hopefully, I'll put you on the spot a little bit. Can you give us any kind of hints or clues about what we can expect to see from Alianza over the course of the rest of this year?
Yeah, great question. The rest of 2022, last year, Alianza launched a slew of new products. We launched an entire new suite of business cloud communications products, which is kind of our unified communications suite. We also launched business text messaging. We launched a new specialty line product. And early last year, we launched a business line product. So there is a lot of new product launches that have just taken place in the last year. And 2022, I think what you're going to see from Alianza is increased speed of delivery around feature functionality for the core business cloud communications products, what we call BCC. And then I think on the mobile side, there's some really interesting things that we're working on that we're really excited about. And then from a market perspective, the solution we have for telcos is making a leap forward. Telcos are a little bit nuanced. If you think about broadband service providers and those different segments I talked about earlier, cable broadband, fiber broadband, wireless broadband, then you have telcos, especially like ILEX and RLEX. Because they're regulated entities, there's some very specific things that they require from a reporting and a regulatory standpoint and a compliance standpoint that Alianza is packaging up, taking to market, bringing, I'll call it, the right partners, the right folks to consult with them and help them make this change in a way that, they're going to get support from the local state PUCs, FCC, et cetera, and really help, I think, a big chunk of the market move to the cloud in a way that they just haven't been able to have confidence in doing so in the past.
But it sounds like there's a lot going on, and I hope we can speak throughout the year as sort of some of this gets released and comes to fruition. But in the meantime, Brian, it's been great to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tom, for having me. Appreciate the time. Hope you have a good one. Talk soon.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. We hope you enjoy the rest of UC Partner Summit, and we'll see you next time.